So good morning, everybody here in Birmingham, and good morning to our registered attendees online. It's really great to have you here. Thank you for those who've turned up in Birmingham. I realise there's been some industrial action taking place, so it may not have been the easiest journey, but we're really great to host you here. And to the online attendees, well done. Thank you for joining us. It's brilliant to be back with Steer here doing our first of our Rethink Rooms, our new programme of debates and events to try and unlock complexity, to bring powerful answers to some of the challenges that face cities' infrastructure and transport. This is the first event of that programme, but we have others lined up later in the season, the fall season, because I'm saying that because some of them are in America, and then we'll see where 2024 takes us. Now, this is a rail event, obviously, but it's rail in what it can do for the country of Britain. And we have done previous rail events, and some of you may have had the opportunity to participate in those previously. Those events were at significant times of positivity, of opportunity, if you say. Back in 2009, we hosted a high-speed rail summit. In 2016, I think it was, Andrew and Stephen Gardner, now the CEO of Amtrak, joined us for the future organisational railway design. What should the future of the railways be structured and look like? And in 2019, we were taking stock of the 10 years anniversary of the Better Stations report. Times of reflection, but times of positivity. Now, myself and the rail team in Steer started pondering where we were in context and whether we should do something this time. And it doesn't quite have that same positivity at the moment, one feels. Clearly, news around HS2 decisions may well pop up later, but clearly it's in the headlines right now. But we're talking about a railway which doesn't quite have that positivity. Does it hear from politicians and decision makers in quite the same warmth that it was previously talked about? We know the railway is challenged. It's got a lack of confidence around its outputs and trajectory of improvement performance. Rail reform from the Williams Rail Reform has largely stalled. There's very little visible progress on it. And we can see fundamentally further investment in rail is being questioned, obviously. All that in the context of government facing some very large financial affordability challenges for the public sector as a whole. So how does rail play its role? And that sort of teed us up for this conversation that myself and my colleagues wanted to sort of stimulate with our clients and partners in the sector. How do we recalibrate Britain's railway paradigm to what is a fundamentally changed context and system post-pandemic, post-Brexit and trade patterns? How do we restore confidence? So how do we demonstrate relevancy of the railway to decision makers at a local and national level? How do we improve the effectiveness of rail, improve the confidence that actually when we say we'll do something, we achieve it, or when you invest money, it's going to be a good value return? And how do we do that quickly? If rail reform and legislation is not going to come, then how does the railway grasp of today's reality and move forward? So, 3 conversations over the next 3 weeks. This is the first. We're looking at the challenge through 3 different perspectives. Growth and productivity for the economy to help fund the pressing needs of the state. We know that there are challenges around funding health, education, immigration, prisons reform, or whatever. Those are things which can only be funded if the economy is functioning and productive, and we've got increasing productivity to encourage further investment. The second, how does rail play to its strengths? What is it that the rail services and the rail assets can offer to help build and sustain sustainable communities? How do we provide equitable access to jobs, housing, education, health, etc.? And then the last, a unique perspective perhaps for a public sector funded organisational sector. How do we lean into serving passengers so that we can grow our revenues to reduce the demand on taxpayers for further support? So that challenge of moving forward on reducing net subsidy. I'm pleased to say over the last heavy lobbying that we've done, and I apologise for the amount of social media that myself and my colleagues have put out, we've got over 350 people signed up for those conversations, but there are still more places available to join us in Manchester on the 11th, or in London on the 18th, or join us again online. So, let's start off with where we're going next. Today's session, 4 great participants. I'm very grateful for their support in participating in it today, and a quick intro to those, although I'm sure many of you know them already. We're joined by Andrew Haines, who's the CEO of Network Rail since 2018, and Andrew joined the organisation and immediately set to task to try and focus the organisation back into serving the local needs of communities and of passengers through his Putting Passengers First reform. He's been asked by government to take forward rail reform through establishing Great British Rail's transformation team, as also engaging Network Rail in key planks of reform. He clearly comes with prior experience of leading First Group's rail division as well as South West Railways, and also as CEO of the Civil Aviation Authority. He's joined by Alistair, Chief Exec of Keolis for the UK and Ireland since 2010. Alistair has got a pedigree of supporting private sector participation and shaping the industry from that angle, clearly successfully bidding and operating numerous public transport operations, including the Docklands Railway and Manchester Metrolink, and including now operations in Qatar, Dubai and India. We're joined by Maggie Simpson, Director General of the Rail Freight Group, who since 2005 has been supporting the progression of freight through numerous challenges of government change, economic change and commodity change through that period. And lastly, Mallory Rowe joins us. He's got 2 roles, the Executive Director for West Midlands Rail Executive, as well as Director of Rail for Transport for the West Midlands. Mal's recently joined this summer that organisation, but has 10 years of working for the Welsh Government and then Transport for Wales, bringing forward their quite radical proposals, both for the Wales and Borders franchise, but also the Cardiff Valley lines. And he was also Assistant Director for Rail for the Liverpool City region. So that's our panel. We've got 3 great speakers from Andrew, Alistair and Maggie, and Mal's going to, as I say, will be responding to that, reflecting on what it means to the West Midlands. But we want you to participate as well. This is meant to be an exploration through the 3 events we've got, and that starts today. So here in the room, we're going to ask you to participate in the discussion through Q&A. And if you're online, you'll be able to find the chat function just if you scroll down from our website window, or if you're on YouTube, you can scroll down, you'll find a chat function. Please participate by asking us Q&A on that chat function. It will come to me on my phone. I'm not being rude. I'm just looking for the questions. And you can also add comments and contributions to what you are reflecting. And I personally would very much welcome your reflections after the event by emailing me, and we will consolidate those across the 3 events to produce some synthesis of what we've heard. So please lean in, feel ready to get engaged, and with that, we will start the day, and I'm going to invite Andrew to come up and give us his presentation. Thanks.
Try and draw the curtain because your halo then was absolutely dazzling me. Is that better? Yeah. The thought of me with a halo is just not credible. So, look, thank you for the invitation, Mike Steer. I get lots of invitations to speak, and I speak quite a lot. But the reason I took this one because I thought it felt like a genuinely helpful, constructive attempt to put some policy context into some big decisions. So hopefully we can have a useful conversation in that context. Like, I want to start with a statement that I hope we can all agree on, which is that the railways do have a fundamental role to play in our country's economic growth. We know that the railway moves goods and people quickly, safely and reliably across the country over long distances, day in and day out. And in my role as Chief Executive of Network Rail, you absolutely are aware of just how the railway is something that never stops, not for a second of a day. In some segments of our economy, it is the backbone, critical infrastructure. And in the 20 to 30 years prior to COVID, we saw economic activity increasingly move to urban areas and cities, which have become the powerhouses of our British economy. Cities are particularly important in Britain because of the kind of economy we've become. Highly developed service sector, specialising in knowledge-based jobs like finance, law, IT, science, consultancy. And for businesses in these sectors, the best areas to locate to boost productivity and access to labour are where there are lots of people and other businesses working in proximity and where transport links are good. The economists call it agglomeration. Cities make up 9% of the land in Britain, and yet they're responsible for around 2/3 of economic output. And that, I think, is the fundamental, the single, probably most significant statistic that we need to bear in mind in this conversation. That's why rail is good for cities and cities are good for rail. But recently, of course, we faced the headwind of COVID. The pandemic forced us, and indeed many cities, into an existential crisis about the future role of cities. And the post-pandemic recovery has varied widely from city to city. I was in Cardiff talking to colleagues in August, and commuting in Cardiff, rail travel in Cardiff is barely 2/3 of what it was pre-COVID. In other parts of the country, we are seeing very significant growth. But there is a reality that many people and businesses have chosen to be either fully remote or have made significant adjustments, and this has changed the balance of activity in city centres. I don't believe that fundamentally results in a shift in our economy in the long term, but it does mean we're in an era of some uncertainty. And the effect of this turbulence is pretty profound and has an impact on some of our key markets. Lower revenues from commuters and business travellers have weakened the classic business case to invest in improvements on the railway, which could generate improved performance and provide a way to boost passenger confidence and demand. And yet at the same time, strong growth in leisure traffic on some significant flows is constrained by a weekend and off-peak offering, which provides insufficient capacity to offer a quality of service that will make rail a preferred mode rather than a last resort. When you combine that with the pernicious effect of what is now almost 18 months of industrial action, nationally we are seeing a tailing off of revenue growth at around about 75% of pre-COVID levels on a like-for-like basis. That's when you strip out what you'd expect from inflation and the very significant impact of the Elizabeth line, much of which, whether we like it or not, is a transfer of journeys from what previously regarded as TfL to National Rail. Now, if we are to break that barrier to investing in Britain's railways so that we can play our full part at a time when public and personal finances are stretched, then the ways we seek to improve our product offering must be smart, sustainable, and represent excellent value for money. And I say that at a time when our costs are going in the wrong direction. In the year before COVID, rail cost government and taxpayers 11.6 billion. That's including operating and capital subsidy net of revenue. And that's a number actually which is going up quite significantly, largely as a result of the additional costs of the intercity express trains. Roads cost around about £12 billion a year to maintain and bring in about 35 billion in tax through fuel duty and car tax. Rail mode, we are being told repeatedly by our Prime Minister and Secretary of State, has a mode share of 2 to 3% of journeys. They tend not to mention that actually it's about 10% of distance travel. But 2 to 3% makes rail look bad. We know that there was a one-off issue with COVID, an injection of subsidy for COVID, and we recognise that we were exceptionally well blessed in that level of support, but we also know that is not sustainable. This year we expect rail revenue to hit circa £10 billion, and maybe next year creeping over that figure, but as I said, the rate of revenue growth has slowed very materially in the last year or so. So how do we contribute to economic growth and productivity in that context? Well, as I said, for passenger services, in the first instance, high volume urban and interurban travel are the core markets where we have a strong competitive advantage against road. Speed and the ability to use time productively, assuming, of course, that the train isn't overcrowded, are the two big selling points we have. Rail is also demonstrably safer. Of course, we take that for granted. We don't shout about it, but we should celebrate it, and we must not rest on our laurels. Of course, many rail markets will be dependent on the ability to connect beyond station to station. And so, until we provide reliable, efficient interchange, that does act as a constraint on road growth and rail's economic ability to access some new markets. The cost of providing rail compares favourably to cars if you intensively use the fixed assets of track and train. And this is especially true when they can deliver marginal revenue outside of peak times without triggering costs. The pandemic has also ripped up the rule book in terms of classic investment cases. The intensive use of assets in the peak has weakened, which is no longer as intense as it was, and that has weakened the case to invest in infrastructure and rolling stock to meet peak demand, because you don't need it 5 days a week now. I guess the question for us really is that such a bad thing? Did it ever really make economic sense to invest in assets that were used once, twice a day for maybe an hour or 2 hours a day? And I say that because I think it's really important. If we're going to make a case for the economic benefits of rail, then we should be honest and objective about the things we're really good at, and not seek to make a case for everything because it happens to run on steel wheels. Sorry, steel rails and steel wheels, indeed. Of course, not everything has to make that cold direct financial return. Rails can support economic growth and address regional productivities. And we are seeing some significant investments around that. And as a nice example, central London has around 2.5 to 3 million jobs, and the GVA per person is around 40k per person higher than the national average. But many people can't afford or don't want to live in London, and rail gets around 500,000 people into London for that work. And we wouldn't see the same level of activity and productivity in London if rail didn't exist. Where I would slightly chastise Mike on his Cassandra-like opening comments is, of course, it's all too easy in this slightly unreal world we're in currently to ignore some of the massive investment that is being made. I'm thinking particularly of the Transpennine route upgrade, circa £10 billion on transforming services between the northwest and the northeast. In any normal rail investment context, that would be a massive deal, not something that doesn't merit a mention. But of course, at the moment, it's overshadowed by the controversy and uncertainty surrounding HS2. It's a 15-year programme, a commitment to major new infrastructure, decarbonisation, journey time improvements, capacity uplift, reliability enhancements, transforming the experience of key stations and interchanges, and yes, it could do more for freight as well. It is a clear example of where national and regional politicians are committed to and investing heavily in rail because of what rail does for the wider economy. The other example we see in that context, of course, is East-West Rail. East-West Rail has a profoundly strong economic business case because of the housing opportunities it unlocks, particularly in North Cambridgeshire. Phenomenal billions of GVA that can only really be unlocked in the 21st century by rail. As a pure transport scheme, it fails almost all the appraisal criteria. But as a broader economic proposition, it's a very strong case. Indulge me for a moment. I do believe that reforming how the rail operates is fundamental if we're really going to deliver on some of those ambitions, though. There is the deeply inconvenient truth that the history of the last decade has been that the system has failed to deliver on its promises in return for the investment it's had. Northwest electrification, Manchester reconfiguring, East Coast Main Line, Great Western Main Line, Thameslink, together represent well more than £10 billion of public investment, and not one of those schemes has delivered the full benefits promised. Not one of those schemes is delivering the timetable that the business case was justified upon. Because all the time you insist on specifying infrastructure, contracts and timetables discreetly, you fail to deliver the benefits in terms of outputs. And that's why I'm such a passionate believer. We need to bring together those levers of infrastructure specification, timetable specification, and contract oversight. Not micromanaging every part of the railway, but when you need to intervene to get the value from those big interventions, then you need to have the levers in your hands. No wonder Treasury officials allegedly roll their eyes when reviewing wider rail industry business cases if we fail to deliver on every single one of our major commitments. Now, I'm not going to say very much about freight simply because Maggie is here, but I don't want to allow that to be misinterpreted as not understanding or not believing in the very significant role that freight plays. I'm sure Maggie will give us the statistics, so I'm going to skip that bit of what's been written here, but we know that rail freight contributes close to £3 billion to the UK economy. We know that in practice, the decarbonisation challenge of heavy haulage on the roads is immense. If the Prime Minister genuinely wants to be the motorist's friend, then actually getting lorries off the road is probably as good a thing as he could do, particularly for those of us in the room who are regular users of the A34, and I know there's at least a few of those, Richard. And so the decarbonisation benefits of freight are something that we as a system, I think, have thus far failed to land in a noisy territory. The other thing I want to say very briefly is that we see today, yesterday, the last few days, the power of a regional mayor who has a strong voice. And that's why I think it's really, really important, if we're going to unlock the economic benefits of the railway, then we're able to work coherently with those combined mayoral authorities and the players that we, frankly, are not so dependent upon Whitehall and Horsecars Road and Treasury for funding, because we've diversified into our partners, that we're easier to do business with, either with the private sector, be it in the development of freight terminals, or with those combined mayoral authorities, because we're structured, we're focused in a way that allows us to deliver for those players and their broader economic perspective as well. I could talk forever on this subject, but I just want to wrap up by saying rail has, I believe, a symbiotic relationship with the success of cities. Successful cities need rail, and rail thrives moving the large numbers of people into and between successful cities. I don't believe that's going to change. We've had a blip, we've had a setback, but we're already seeing in many places a shift in pattern, but also a very real return to the railway. What we've not yet seen is the railway's ability to respond to that shift in demand, and that is our challenge. If we're going to continue to play that role, we cannot rest on our laurels. We cannot assume that the economics of the last 20 years are actually going to be the building blocks for the future. But I am absolutely positive that whatever is announced in the next few days, whatever happens with rail reform in the next year in the run-up to a general election, those of us who care passionately and believe passionately in the power of rail to enhance our economy have a serious job to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for kicking us off with that one. And I'm going to hand over to Alistair now, please.
Always hard to follow Andrew. But fortunately, he said a few of the things that I'll say. So repetition always means that people remember the message. So good morning, everybody. I'm delighted also to be here. Thank you, Steers, for inviting me to the conference and take part in a subject that really means a lot to me, the passion for the railways and recalibrating them. My introduction to the railway started with Steers. I worked for Jim Steer nearly 30 years ago doing passenger forecasts in the first round of privatisations. And throughout that time, it always feels like there's been a need to review the railway, to look at what it's doing, to do some kind of systematic change. As I said, I'm the Chief Executive of Keolis UK. It means I've been fortunate enough to sit on 7 operating top boards. And most recently, one of the ones was Wales and Borders, where we not only operate the trains, but we've also tried to do some maintenance on the network and enhancing the network. Over that time of running operating companies, we've seen lots of challenges in the railway, whether it's trying to reduce the cost base, whether it's trying to drive and protect the revenue, whether it's around safety, or whether around quality. But I think I can honestly say that I've never worked in the railway where colleagues who work for us are so demotivated. And I think that's because they're being starved currently of leadership from the top, and they don't have the vision for what they're meant to be doing. They're constantly being micromanaged and told why they can't implement ideas or why they can't make change. And they've lost their passion for running our railway. And you see it when you travel around the network. Andrew mentioned about all the investment we've got in the network, but it looks like a network at the moment that's uncared for and is unmanaged, despite the amount of work that's going into doing that. So that's a little about me. I work for Keolis. We're an international transport company, majority owned by SNCF, which is the French state-run railway. We operate transport systems all around the world, from railways, metros, trams, buses, and we operate in some of the world's largest cities. We currently run 7 rail networks, one of them in the UK with Go Ahead, GTR, the largest rail franchise in the UK, but also the largest rail franchise in the world. But we also run the trains in Boston, we run the trains in Adelaide. So we're very, very familiar with UK rail, and we're very familiar with benchmarking it with other countries. And actually, when you benchmark it with other countries, we're not doing too badly. We kick ourselves, but we're not doing badly. Why do we need to recalibrate the railways? Well, for me, there's 3 main reasons for this. Firstly, and Andrew touched on it a bit, over the last few years, we've taken a hammering in the media for poor delivery, which has been a massive impact on the public perception on the service we offer. And I'm used to everyone complaining about the railway, but actually, the people who use it used to give us quite good customer satisfaction ratings. I mean, not brilliant, but the people who used it quite liked the railway, and actually we've let them down. And we've had the last stories over the last 5 years of late deliveries of projects. We've had stories about huge overspend, and I'm not even talking about HS2 there. I'm talking about Crossrail and other projects. We've had the collapse of the franchising system, which I don't think is a bad thing, franchises failing, because it shows that actually private sector are taking risk, but there is a fear that suddenly the railways are going to disappear in certain areas. And there's been a massive impact on timetable changes which have gone wrong, and as we come out of COVID, with shortage of drivers, services being cancelled, which means we haven't been able to provide a reliable service. Also, since COVID, there's been a massive change in demand. So while passenger volumes have started to creep back up to the same volume as pre-COVID, the revenue's not there. And Andrew again said we're at 75 to 80% of the revenue like for like, and it's been impacted by the current industrial action. But actually, if you dig deep into the revenue, what we've seen is the commuter revenue disappearing on us. The person who bought the annual or the monthly or the weekly season ticket is now only often only coming into the office 3 times a week or less. The high yield business traveller is now only doing the face-to-face meeting every other time, so he's travelling half as much. But we have seen a big increase in leisure traffic. And, you know, we all got stuck in isolation for a year, 18 months, and we've wanted to go out and do stuff, and that's continued. So we have a new peak now. So Mondays and Friday mornings are quiet, but we've got a big surge on Thursday nights. We've got a big surge at the weekend. And we have to find a way to make our railways work for that as well. And then post-COVID, we've struggled to offer a good service. So there's been industrial action from both the RNT and from ASLEF, which has meant actually you don't really know when the trains are running anymore. And staff shortages has meant cancellations. And that means it's difficult to actually depend on the railways. And people who use the railways need to depend on it. And that's before you even come to the complicated fare system. So people feeling they can buy a ticket that's affordable, that's the cheapest ticket they could have bought, and customers' perception then is that perhaps we're ripping them off, and we need to change that. So, what does the railway look like for tomorrow if it's successful? Well, I guess basically there's 3 different stakeholders for our railways. There's the government, who fund it. There's the passengers who use the service daily or weekly or even very, very infrequently. And then there's the 240,000 colleagues who directly work for the industry. And not surprisingly, all 3 of those stakeholders have different needs from the railway. Cynically, the government needs to get re-elected. So while they focus on the national health or schools or immigration policy, railways always take the headlines for them. And they get a huge amount of focus and attention because of the political noise they generate when things do go wrong. So the railways still remain the quickest and safest form of transport to move people around between our large cities. And they play a vital role in connecting the communities that sit in those cities and reducing carbon emission, and we should remember that. We all remember the William Shapps Review, which underpins the current government policy, and they had three real main headlines. The railway needs to be affordable, it needs to have a reform of the fares and ticketing system, and it also needs to replace franchising, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Our customers, over the time that I've worked in the railways, have been very consistent in what they want. They want a reliable and punctual service that's dependable. They want better value. They want to feel like they're getting the cheapest ticket. But they also want a railway that's integrated, so works if they're using two different rail services, or works if they're using other transport services when they get to their destination at the station. So cross-modal with buses, with trams, with other modes, and ticketing that works across there as well. And then it probably comes to our staff, because that's probably one of the biggest headlines at the moment, all the industrial action we've got. And when you talk to staff in the railway, that they say is they want a safe place to work, obviously, and that's been difficult to do during COVID, where we've seen more attacks and abuse of some of the frontline staff. They often want a really strong career progression, so know where they're going to be in the future, and they value job security. They really like the fact that the railway is a good place to work. And throughout the time I've worked in the railways, we've managed to offer all of those for our staff. And while some of our colleagues purely have only worked in the railway, a lot have worked in other careers. They're from a military background, or they're from the emergency services, or they're from retailing or other travel and tourism. And they really value working for the railway industry. But often we give them only operational jobs, and we've got to find a way to get the people who work in the railway to be customer focused and providing passengers a service, not just operating the railway. So how do we achieve this? Well, I think that's the hard bit, really. It's very easy to put it onto a PowerPoint presentation, but achieving it is very difficult. The first part is good leadership, and I'm not criticising the leadership at the moment. Running the railway is really complex, but we need a long-term strategy and a clear view on what we're trying to achieve. And then let the team get on with it. Hold them to account on delivering it, and stop suddenly changing the mind or changing direction. We need to remove the silos. The railway is a whole system. It must be run as a system, not as an infrastructure provider, an operator, a train provider. It must be run as a whole system, and Andrew touched on that as well. Once you have the strategy and once you know what you want to deliver, then a whole system should set the timetable, deliver the timetable, and all of it should be committed into delivering it. We sometimes talk about sort of major projects and what's go wrong. It's because it's all delivered in silos, and each silo, if you're the train operator, you think the maintainer won't deliver the network provider thinks the operator won't be ready, and we're all waiting for someone to fail, and that doesn't work. I hope you realise that my presentation is very customer-centric. Any business to be successful needs to focus on the customer, which means we must provide a predictable service that is affordable. I've talked about the change in demand, and what we noticed over COVID is we must be more flexible in what we operate in the railway. The idea that we set a timetable 7, 8 months in advance and then deliver that the same timetable Monday to Friday, or even Monday to Saturday every day of the week, I don't think that we can work like that anymore. We certainly don't work like that in the services we provide in the cities on trams. We have timetables changing as the day goes through, so we must get that. And you can't run a railway which isn't properly funded, which means that you need a long-term commitment for the operating costs and for the investment that is required in the asset. But that doesn't mean we have to keep on asking for more and more money, which actually has been the case over the last few years. We must ensure that everything we do is focused on bringing revenue into the railway, but also the money that we spend is efficiently spent. We need to remove waste, and we need to make sure that there's efficiency in our railways. I I thought I had to answer the question of, is there a role for the private sector? I think there is, but there is no right and wrong on what that role is. There are railways in the world that are run that are purely public, and you know, France is a good example of that, where SNCF, through 2 operating companies, run the infrastructure and run the operations. There's railways kind of like ours, which have a mixed public and private sector, like Germany is a good example in the UK. And there's railways that are purely private sector. So Japan, in the 90s, in the 80s, late 80s, moved all their railways into private sector with the JR East, the JR North, the JR South, the JR West. So there isn't a right and wrong. But if you do have the private sector involved, you need clarity on what their role is and what they're doing. And, you know, I go to lots of dinner parties where people think the railways is completely private sector operated, which it clearly isn't. You know, we've got the maintainer, which is Network Rail, but you've also got a highly specified contracts from the government who are setting you the timetable, who are setting the fare rises, who really are the backbone behind the railway. And often as the private sector operator, I feel that I'm the pantomime villain. I'm there to take the flak when the fares go up. Yeah. It's a bit early for that, Andrew. It's only October. But you know, there to take the flak when the trains don't run on time, when the trains are cancelled, when fares go up, or when services are cut, and that's not right either. So, if the private sector evolved, you need to leverage their skills, and I think the skills there. I'm a big believer in competition. I think competition drives change, drives flair, drives innovation. So I'm a big believer in the competition, which is what the franchising system did. I think then the private sector brings in innovation. It can bring investment as well, but also it shares the risk and shares the reward, so long as you get that right. And we've had times in the railway where the reward has been wrong. You know, actually operators have made too much money from doing very little, and we've had times when the risk is too big, and we've seen that when franchises fail. So getting that blend right is really important. What's the solution? Well, I think we've got the solution mapped up. We've just got to deliver it. I am a massive fan in GB Railways. You know, one body that sets the strategy for the railway and then delivers it. Proper accountability there, so clear what they're delivering. Arm's length from government. So government don't interfere on every single decision. And also the whole system, so not just Network Rail Plus, but completely in charge of the operating contracts, the rail freight providers, and also the maintainer of the network. That can be done with the private sector through passenger contracts. I operate Docklands Light Railway very successfully with TfL, with a contract that is some inputs. We want you to deliver this, the number of times you wash the trains, but mainly outputs. We want a service where you run 99% of the service, and it's 99% reliable and accurate and punctual. And then when we don't make that, we get penalised. When we do make it, we get incentivised, but not huge amounts of money. Enough to make us get out of bed, but not enough to change all the dials. And I remember when we won that contract, someone once said to me, the difference between a DFT managing director and a TfL managing director is the DFT managing director opens up the Financial Times and looks at the share price, whereas the TfL managing director looks at the rainbow boards to see what punctuality is. So someone who passionately cares about how the railway is run. So we can have the passenger contracts, real service outputs, so saying what we need to deliver. The ability, too often when you run these contracts, everyone's scared of change because of procurement challenge, but actually we don't know what we need to do, what service we need to run in 5 or 6 years' time. So you need the flexibility to be able to change those contracts. And despite not having revenue incentive in my TfL contracts, you need some form of revenue incentive. The railway needs to be cared about. It needs to be driving the way that we set our fares, the way that we market the product, the way that we deliver the product, and also the way that we collect the revenue, because I think we are losing a lot of revenue at the moment from not collecting it properly. And then finally, there needs to be a real willingness for change, a a real willingness to change from government, a real willingness to change from DfT, and a real willingness to change from all of the colleagues who work in the railway. This means we need a proper governance, a proper structure to deliver that railway, and we need to take our colleagues with us and use them to deliver the service, not fight with them. Thank you very much.
Alistair, many thanks for that contribution as well, and I'm going to head straight into Maggie. Thank you very much, Maggie.
Thank you very much, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Like Alistair, I also worked for Jim Steer very briefly at Strategic Rail Authority. He was one of the best bosses I ever had. It was possibly the most boring job I ever had, but there we go. It's been kind of Andrew and Alistair not to speak about freight, and that gives me the opportunity to do so and share my perspectives on how freight can help the railways rebalance its position in the UK economy and help the passenger railway on its journey to recover from the shock of COVID. I think if you stand back and look at the press coverage that we're seeing this week, last week around HS2, and indeed around the railways generally, if you were not a railway person, you could conclude that the railways in this country are expensive and irrelevant. Andrew makes the 2% point. None of us here believe that, but you could read that into that coverage. And I think there is a danger that if we move forward with the much needed efficiency, cost-cutting measures, that we end up with a railway which is cheap and perceived as irrelevant. And we can't afford to let that happen. So whilst we take those measures to rebuild the cost base into a more efficient place, we've also got to work on how we rebuild the railway's relevance, both to people who use it and to people who don't use it. And I think that we need to think about what people associate with the railway when they think about that. And Andrew made some compelling points about the railway's place in the economy of cities, and I was struck by that. But what else is that we ought to be associating with, being part of, being seen to be part of, if we are to rebuild railway's place in our economy and society? And that's really what I want to talk about through a freight lens. I want to talk about the logistics sector for a moment. So Logistics UK, the trade body who cover businesses right across freight and logistics sector, all modes, recently published a report. That report showed that the logistics system in the UK, road freight, rail freight, air freight, warehousing, etc., contributes £163 billion a year to the UK economy. It employs 2.7 million people, that's over 8% of the UK workforce. Now, by contrast, if you take the most recent data from Railway Industry Association, rail is contributing around £43 billion to the UK economy. So the logistics sector, broadly speaking, is 4 times as important as the railways. And of course, most people don't spend any part of their daily life thinking about the UK logistics sector. But actually, we all think about it all the time when we go to the shop, when we get a parcel delivered, all of those things. So the impact of the UK logistics sector touches every single person, even if they never travel on a train at all. So it touches the 97% of people who don't use the railway on a daily basis. And rail is part of that number. I've actually set a challenge to people to go, well, if your logistics is 163 billion, how can rail only be 3? There's something missing there. We need to sort out the numbers. But the point is that rail is about 10% of UK logistics. So you can take your own version of those numbers. So we're an important part of a sector that's 4 times bigger than the railways, and yet we don't know that. So that's a really important association. The other really important thing that came out from Logistics UK is about the journeys that the logistics sector has had in recent years, and that has not been particularly pretty. If you look at the rankings, the World Bank do a logistics productivity ranking. The UK has always scored really highly in that as having very efficient and productive logistics. But that's plummeted. We've gone from 4th to 19th over the last few years. Brexit is a big part of that. The border controls, customs delays, etc., has been a part of that, but so also has been poor infrastructure, both road and rail, deteriorating infrastructure or lack of investment compared to other comparator companies. Both of those are playing in that drop, and no doubt things like HGV driver shortages and a whole host of other measures beside. And when that figure drops, obviously that impacts on the value that gets delivered, but it also impacts on all of us as consumers. The famous toilet roll shortage at the beginning of COVID, delays, difficulty in getting your goods. These are all things that are impacting on people. So for the railways, there's a really important role in helping UK logistics restore its position to become more productive, to be more economically important. We can do that by looking at how we react as an industry, by becoming more cost efficient, by becoming quicker, by challenging the way that we operate freight on the network to get more productivity out of the services that we run. But more importantly even than that, we can get more people to come on to rail. And Andrew referred to the decarbonisation benefits of rail freight, which are already bringing a lot of people to the door of rail looking for their place on that. So there's a huge amount we can do to become much more relevant to the UK logistics sector as a whole as we are, and to really showcase that and promote it in the way that we as an industry promote ourselves. The second point I want to make is about inward investment. Now, I haven't put everything that's happening on an inward investment on that slide. So if anybody's watching online from a free port that I haven't mentioned, I apologise. There are many, many more of you. But when we look at the amount of money that people are looking to spend in the UK on big schemes like this, it is enormous. The Thames Freeport, in 1 year since opening, has already generated £600 million of inward investment. Government has just committed £500 million to Tata Steel for electric arc conversion in South Wales. Rail-link warehousing, these are billion-pound schemes, each and every one, happening across the East Midlands and proposals in the North West and elsewhere. Green energy in Scotland, I was talking to the Scottish Transport Minister, Fiona Hislop, recently. The prospects for investment in green energy, hydrogen, alternative fuels in Scotland are enormous. And whenever I go and speak to the people who are involved in these schemes, they see that rail freight is a hugely important part of that. Let's take electric arc as an example. We stop burning coal, tick, we start melting scrap. Where do we think the scrap's coming from? It's coming from Birmingham, it's coming from Manchester, it's coming from London, and guess what? They want it to come on a train. So these schemes are vitally important to the UK economy. They get government ministers excited. And where is the railway? Because when most of these people talk to the railways, yes, they get a good response from those rail freight people in the Fox and at Network Rail, but from the system as a whole, generally what we get is, there aren't any paths. Oh, we want some more passenger trains. Oh, you can have a connection, but it's 4 years and £60 million. I go to a Thames Freeport event. I don't see senior rail leaders in the room. And we're missing a trick because we're not associating ourselves with things that get government ministers out of bed, create jobs, create employment. If the Thames Freeport, to stay with that example, is successful, it will put thousands of jobs in at the Thames estuary, and those people will want to travel by train to get there. So that it's not even only a freight story, it's a passenger story as well. So we've got to grab our association with these things. They're hugely important to the UK economy, and we are missing a trick. The final thing I want to talk about is customers. You've probably all seen this chart before. It's rail freight's journey through the last decade. And let me be clear that COVID was a baby. Yeah? You can't even see it on that chart. What we experienced in rail freight in 2014-15 is what the passenger railway is experiencing now. And that is a loss of your monopoly customers. So when we've come through that, And let's be clear, there are lots of people who didn't think we would come through that. What we've had to do is to learn to respond to a different type of customer. And this is a journey that is still ongoing. I can't put my hand up and say rail freight has got this completely right. But the lines that predominate now, the yellow and the grey on that chart, construction and intermodal, these are a different type of customer, principally because they have choice. Each and every one of those customers can move off to road freight if they wish to. They have to use rail. Equally, those customers want to use rail. They really want to use rail. They don't have to, they really want to. And what they want to do is invest in rail, have partnerships with rail, to be seen as an important part of that journey. In committing their supply chain to us, they expect delivery of their ambitions, but they're prepared to work with us to spend their money to achieve that. So they're a different kind of customer, just as Alistair spoke about the leisure customer. And so the way that we've run the railways historically doesn't necessarily work for what these people want now. Ports are open 7 days a week, but the railway isn't. Retailers, when you talk to, as I have done this week, DHL or, other retailers, they want to know about W12 gauge. They don't care. What they want to know is, can we pick up their goods at a time that meets their delivery window? Because their delivery window, it's 9 p.m. at whatever it is warehouse. Can we meet that? Can we meet that every day of the week? So their demands are very different. And we in rail freight are learning their language. We're having to do that. We're having to learn what matters to those customers. And I think there's a huge parallel with what we've talked about today. I mean, Alistair mentioned on time and affordable. And of course, as customers of the railway, we expect that. Rail freight's customers expect that. But what else do they expect? Probably, if I'm a customer today getting on the train, I want to know I can get my luggage on the rack. I probably, well, not now, but I might have wanted to know if I can get my pram on. Do I really have to ticket check at the ramps at Euston when I've got my coffee and my soup, etc. And my customers want the same thing. What they want from the railway now isn't what they wanted 5 years ago. So to associate with the customers that we've got, we have to start to do things differently. We have to build the partnerships and we have to understand in detail what those customers want and how best we can get there. Because let me be clear, they really, really want rail. Rail freight resonates in boardrooms today in a way that I have never seen it. So the opportunity for us is enormous. And I think there are lessons in freight for the passenger railway as well on the journey that we've been over in the last decade. So thank you very much, and I guess it's over to Mel.
Three great presentations, some great catchlines, honest and assessment, feeding city economies, losing a monopoly customer, some great points of reflection. Mal, what would you like? Give us your perspective of what you've heard, the application to West Midlands.
I think, first of all, fuel. There's a lot there to digest, so I've gone through the presentations. But I guess, can I just take the liberty of saying who I am, maybe
Please.
a bit more? So Mal Rose, I'm the Executive Director for West Midlands Rail Executive and the Director of Rail for Transport for West Midlands. I want to quickly say who we are, because I'm not sure everyone would know that. But West Midlands Rail Executive, in effect, is a company limited by guarantee representing all local people of West Midlands. So quite a wide region, so 14 authorities, and that includes the 7 metropolitan boroughs that you'll be familiar with, Birmingham, Coventry, etc. But also includes Worcestershire, Herefordshire, Cheshire East, and even West Northamptonshire. So a very broad church, and of course we have elected leaders who represent their areas on our board. So I just wanted to say who we are, so I think that's really important to the context that I'm going to say. So I would say we are the local champions. So devolution, we all know that's been pushed out. We've seen successes of that throughout the whole GB some time ago. So I'm very passionate about devolution. Been here for a couple of months, but actually I was in Liverpool for a period of time and also in Welsh Government where I did quite a bit on devolution. So what I'm going to talk about is how rail is relevant on economic for people, i.e. you, people who actually use the rail system. So I think that's where I'm going to come, Mike, I want to take that liberty of just explaining to people in the room and onto online where we come from. Right, so where do I start? Andrew, I think I'll just go through some key points, I think, that I want to pick up. And actually, it's difficult not to agree with a great deal of what's said. In fact, I'd like to agree with that. Clearly, costs are a big challenge for the industry since COVID. We've talked about that today. And I think there is something around agility in how we manage resources together, sort of going forward from a local level. So is the service patterns correct as we have today with the amount of patronage we have? And I think it's a bit of a catch-22 because travel to work areas, people want to turn up and go service. They don't have to look up on the timetables. They can just turn up. And I think Andrew mentioned the cities. Absolutely important that there is a transport system that does give connectivity to people to actually get to work, get to social events, see their families, and actually healthcare. It's very important that the rail system does that. I think another point is it's about integration. It's touched on in our presentations, but I didn't, integration of rail, it cannot be in silo. Rail is not always going to be the solution for connectivity. Indeed, many people have to use their car to get to a station or a bus, and actually it's not always, you need to look at the wider picture. So cars actually do come part of it. Can't ignore it, because actually some people need a car to get to the station, to get to service. So I think we need to look at it from that broader picture. Investment is interesting what's gone into the system, and probably over my career, I've seen a great deal of local funding go into rail, which I'm very passionate, and I've been very lucky to have political leaders, and yes, Andy Street is the chair of West Midlands Rail Executive and somebody that I represent and work with a great deal. And I'm very lucky to have worked with politicians who are very passionate about rail. I think that's, and public transport in general. So that's a really good positive as well. So I think investment comes from, you have now government funding combined mayoral authorities in terms of improving infrastructure. That was touched on by Andrew. And I actually think that's a great thing. Bringing local transport, aligning that with growth for the local area is really essential. And I think local leaders and local organisations are probably best placed to be able to work together to be able to do that with the industry and also with government. I'm just going to go through, I've got lots of notes here, sorry, you'll bear with me. Okay, so going to Alistair, lots of good stuff there about demotivation of the sector, leadership and micromanagement. There is I'm going to be honest, there's a drift. There's a drift in leadership, and we feel it locally, absolutely no question. And as we look, sit here today and those online, tomorrow we have another strike. In the West Midlands, pretty much apart from Transport for Wales, there'll be hardly any service, in fact, no service. Now, I'm sorry to say that is the reality that we're facing. In terms of having a sustainable system, people that can trust them, we've got to sort out the industrial relations challenge. And look, it's a white elephant in the room, but I'm going to say it because it is a big problem. And in terms of getting confidence back into the sector, you've got to sort this out. Now, I've got no magical, I'm not involved in those discussions, so maybe it's easy for me to say this, but I absolutely think we've got to work together to unlock that challenge. Because it isn't just about the railway today, it's about railways next year. Because a lot of the issues will be about training resources, drivers on new trains. This problem will continue unless we can find a resolution. And I'm not on anyone's side, I'm just saying that is a real issue that we've got to resolve. But absolutely, finding efficiencies, finding an agility railway is really important for us to move the railway into 2023 and 24, and perhaps not in the past where post-COVID we have a changing system. I think the leadership point is a really good one. I'm really proud to say that my team and the West Midlands Rail Executive are working really hard with GBRTT, Network Rail and our partners to see what we can do in absence of GBR. I think it absolutely makes sense to me, did in my previous role, it does in the West Midlands, where we have a very complex system, to be able to bring together under one leadership, a guiding mind, but must include local representation involved in that. I mean, it can't just be another body that doesn't represent local people. And I think that will be a challenge for us. But I'm delighted that we're working really hard with GBRTT as part of our Trailblazer devolution deal. So accepting what Alistair said, actually, I think and Andrew mentioned GBRTT and bringing that leadership. Really important that we also don't just wait. And that's something that I certainly won't want to do in the West Midlands, is wait for legislation for GBR. There are lots of people very passionate about this industry and transport, and we need to work together to see what we can do to improve matters before government legislation comes on board. And I give that commitment. That's something I will certainly be doing. I think in terms of private sector, I think that's what Alistair mentioned that. You know what, I have a lot of sympathy because I've come from both sides of the argument. I've worked in the private sector and public sector. And actually, if you don't incentivise private operators, there is a bit of, well, you know, we're doing a micromanagement contract. And there is a balance, I think. You know, at the end of the day, the private sector has brought in innovation to the sector. I've been part of that. And similarly, you know, the public sector it does that similarly. But I think working together is a potential way forward. But I wrote down shackles here, Alistair, actually. I'm not sure why I wrote that down. I kind of feel like sometimes the industry has shackles on it. Not a criticism, an observation. And I think with shackles means you don't get the customer at the centre because naturally you're driven by cost. You're driven by pressures. And believe me, I've worked in industrial relations climates in my career, and it's a big distraction from dealing with what we want to deliver, a really good service, a reliable service for customers and passengers, and not just those today, those in the future, because that's our role, is to bring people back into the industry.
Mal, sorry to interrupt. We've got Q&A coming in.
I've got a few more bits.
Okay.
I haven't done the freight bit. That's what I want to do. Because poor Maggie, and I think Maggie's is really what she said, actually. Lessons learned from freight. And I found your slides to be interesting about how COVID was a baby, I think is the words that you use. And I think you touched on something that I think for me is really important, is best practice. And are we sharing, as an industry, as local authorities, you know, as the players, our knowledge to get to, you know, a good outcome? And I think that was, for me, that was one of the biggest things you said, and I was pretty shocked to see logistics 4th to 19th. That was a big eye-opener. And I guess, like anybody, as a sort of regional authority, I'm sure we can do more with freight in the sector to improve and move things forward. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mal.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for doing that on the hoof, as it were.
It was a bit.
I will start with the questions. I've got one that I want to ask about capability. So we heard about the need to change. Maggie, you talked about the journey that freight had been on. Andrew, you talking about leaning into that city challenge. And I just wondered what the panel's view were. Are we equipped for that city challenge? What can we learn from the freight journey about how freight capabilities have changed in the industry to serve those new customers? And then lastly, I've got a question from Jonathan Pugh online. What can we learn from the Scottish devolution example and how those capabilities might have changed? Who would like to start us off on that very large but open question? Maggie, perhaps you want to say, what would you like to say about the journey of freight? How has freight capability of the sector changed?
Let me tell you a story I had once. I was talking to a finance director of a very large franchise who probably doesn't work for them anymore, so it doesn't really matter. And I was telling him about a very large strategic freight terminal at Daventry, and he goes, oh, I've never thought about that. Now, his trains went past there pretty often. Pretty enormous trains come out from there. You know, you're struggling to miss a 9'6" container, right? And we hadn't even clocked that it existed. And when you work in the railways, it's complicated stuff, isn't it? You know, I could spend all day, every day on gauge, but we have to force ourselves to look outside the box to see what's happening elsewhere in the economy. So ways where we put ourselves into other environments to learn what is happening elsewhere as senior leaders is hugely, hugely important. I just want to pick up on Jonathan's question as well, the Scottish thing. Devolution in freight is a complicated thing because there are clearly benefits that come from having local accountability and knowledge, and there are clearly disbenefits that come from breaking things up into small parts when your journeys are inherently long. The Valley Lines nearly killed us as a process, frankly. You know, freight, a container that starts in Singapore and ends up in Birmingham, you know, local devolution deals mean nothing to it. So it's a push-pull. But if you're going to give local accountability for local services, you have to have a framework that protects the long distance. And that's what Scottish Government got right. So by incentivising Network Rail in Scotland very forcefully on freight, they did get that win-win of local accountability and protection of the network. and that for me is the key when Mal puts his Trailblazer deal together. How is the freight that runs to Birmingham or through Birmingham or the West Midlands safeguarded in an environment which is focused very much on the local?
Thank you, Maggie.
Look, I think there are three capability gaps, and maybe I'm slightly testing the definition of capability, that I think we all collectively face, but actually some of them are easier to fix than others. The first is whole system understanding. One of the things that really shocked me was that virtually nobody in Network Rail understood about passenger revenue, and therefore, when we were making our investment decisions, we had no reference point. So as part of our CP7 business case, we are looking at every single route section and looking at the revenue that's generated by that, looking at the net cost and saying, okay, do we really have to do that work? Can we do that work more cheaply? Or can we do that work more efficiently from an access perspective? Now we're not, and yes, we'll then find some issues, say actually it may not have huge revenue, but there will be a critical freight flow that means you have to do it this way. But even providing people with the information so they can have that thinking starts to build capability. And there are other examples elsewhere. Secondly, I think there is actually, if we're honest, there's a capacity issue, if you like, around investment. One of the challenges for the freight sector, actually, it doesn't, its shareholders doesn't have access to endless funds. You've seen the volatility of that market. Some of them are quite financially fragile. So accessing other sources of investment are really important. And then that third one is consents. Actually, permission, the capability to get on and do things. Because I think that is one of the things that's the real stranglehold. And all the time, you're indifferent to the people who you work around because you have no ability to influence them or understand how they're working, then we sub-optimize. The first and the third of those, I think, are eminently fixable. The second is harder because there are some tough economic decisions. But we would make a much better case at the second if we actually had more permission and we understood the whole system economics.
Thank you, Andrew. Alistair, any reflections
I
from...
think the revenue point is a really, really big one. I think that we're in a danger of having a railway where no one is looking after the revenue. The operators no longer have anything in their contracts, and it's easier to run a railway when if your output is only delivering the service, it's easier to run a railway with no passengers on it. So actually, if you're not incentivized,
look at the COVID performance statistics.
Well, exactly, it was the best operating period for 6 or 7 years. But it's
for 100 years.
Yeah. Well, we had good years before as well. So you do need to have someone driving the revenue and making sure the product is marketed, it's delivered, and the prices are right and stuff like that. And when I was in France a few weeks ago with SNCF, they've really seen huge bounce back on TGV, and their revenue's now above where it was pre-COVID. They have reservation systems. You have to reserve to get on a TGV system, which means they can yield manage. We don't have that. The convenience of being able to turn up and just get on a train is huge and one of our big selling points, but it means that we struggle to do revenue management or yield management like the airlines do, like other railways do. So I think driving the revenue is a really key part. I think everyone's looking at the costs.
Mal, picking up cities, as you said, you work with Andy Street, etc. Politician, we've heard about having honest, objective conversations about where rail can play to its strengths. How do we help decision makers and elected officials to understand where rail has strengths and where it's probably not best played?
Well, I mean, in my long career, politicians love stations. They like to open a station. We all think we've all been there. I think that's our job, obviously business case. I mean, sorry, but I've got to use that for, in terms of governance as an officer for many years. You have to do, obviously, a business case. But at the end of the day, there can be a direction. I think we've seen that from the decisions that have been taken by all sorts of politicians over the years when a business case perhaps is marginal or even a negative one. But I would say, though, that in terms of that question, it's about us providing the evidence, the options, that, it's not always rail. I think I've explained, said that earlier. There are definitely other options that, bus, of course, is hugely used and also under strain in many ways. So I think from a public transport point of view, it's us getting it over to politicians. And perhaps if we have a reduced amount of funding, which of course we've all talked about and continue to talk about, is how we best use that to provide the best modal shift or whether we, the best sort of mode that delivers what we're trying to achieve in the local transport plans. I think that would be my view.
Thank you, Matt.
Can I very briefly go back to the Scottish question? I mean, there are loads of examples, and I could give you really good examples where I think the Scottish devolution works, and also where it's a bit problematic to on Carstairs Junction is a good example of somewhere where, it's really critical to lots of national flows, and yet funded directly by Transport Scotland. The rational thing for Transport Scotland to do, frankly, is to not invest in in a high-speed. But now it was a very painful process, but we got to a good result in the end. But I would say decarbonisation is the best example that benefits a Scottish devolution, in that they have a long-term plan.
Yes.
And what that's helping us to do is to drive down the unit cost. The unit cost of electrification in Scotland now is less than half of what we delivered on Great Western. And part of that is about being able to go to the supply chain and saying, here's a long-term plan. And also it's about Network Rail continuously challenging our own standards, because we know we've got to come in year after year after year. And it's probably the single biggest strategic example of where we've seen the power of devolution. And the key thing is that Scotland has accountability for spending the money. There's no point in giving specification rights to people if you don't give them accountability, because all they end up doing is specifying the world. Because, of course, why wouldn't you? We would all do the same. And that's the dynamic, really, is having that accountability and then having a long-term plan.
Okay. Vision, stability, consistency, locally.
And it drives efficiency is the point as a consequence.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to the room. Any questions in the room? I can see one in the corner there. There's a microphone just coming to you, Dave.
Thank you very much. My name's Dave Harding. I'm an economist in Network Rail. Alistair, you mentioned competition. Is competition always a good thing for the rail industry?
Alistair.
Wow. Yes.
There we have it.
I think competition is good. I think competition, forces you to look at what you're doing. When I started doing franchise bids, we were doing them then probably 1 or 2 a year, and that felt right, in the sense that you then had a chance to really look at what your operations were doing, take the good bits and put them into a future bid or future offer, or take the bad bits and sort them out. When we started to do 5 or 6 franchise bids a year, it became, you just copied and pasted. You didn't think about the solutions. So I think there is when you do a franchise bid, it's like doing a really big business plan. And I think doing a business plan every couple of years is really good for a business, but doing it 6 times a year isn't good. So that's what I think on the franchising. I think competition is healthy. Yeah, I do believe that it changes the way that people look at things and their approach to things. And I'm also, when some of the franchises collapse, I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think this is something that the government should be disappointed with or embarrassed about. It means that they've driven the commercial and private sector right to the limit. And we put bonds in place to protect us against that. So we should put sensible bids in. But there have been times when there's not been sensible bids.
Andrew?
I think we have to distinguish between, particularly in rail, and competition for the market or competition in the market. I think competition for the market is very healthy, generally speaking, in terms of franchising process or contracting process, because it does, most of the evidence from the economy is then that actually, frankly, we all need a bit of jeopardy. Yeah. I know I do when I get up in the morning. I think it's probably true of most people as well. That sense, it gives you an edge, and that therefore, I think there's lots of evidence as well that single tender negotiations do not end up in any sector of the economy delivering as good value as a competitive context. I think competition in the market is much more complex. It can generate value, but boy, you need the right incentives. The difficulty with competition in the market is we're all rational beings, and most of us will go for the easy money. And without the right incentives, you end up with things which are actually value diminishing for the sector as a whole. The obvious example are silly all-cats rates, which are entirely rational from an operator's perspective. And I did it as much as anyone else when I was running train companies. But the idea that they grow the overall market is manifestly wrong. Very often they harm the overall market. So if you're going to have competition in the market, you need to be super smart in the incentives you have. I'm not against it per se, but you've really got to think about how, what incentives I've got to make sure that works for the end user or the specifier or the funder according to what it is they want to do.
Thank you.
Look, I would run an organisation that was founded by freight customers who frankly had had enough of British Rail because the service
Yeah.
they got was
Yeah.
shambolic. And they got together around a kitchen table in Oxford and they formed the Rail Freight Group. And privatisation happened and we've had competition since then, and it has driven growth. It's driven innovation. It's caused people to look at what their customers need in a different way. It's changed the market totally. And if you are a customer of, you know, logistics provider, you know, Dunelm or whoever, every 3 years you go out, you tender your road haulage contract. You're used to having choice. So saying to them, oh, actually, you know, when you come to rail, it's just, you know, that one company, they'll just walk. So competition is absolutely fundamental to a vibrant rail freight sector. Of course, what competition does in the market, and we've seen the stuff about supermarket prices coming down this morning, what it does is it drives down costs. So when it drives down costs, of course, the amount of surplus revenue that's available for profit or handing back to Network Rail in access charge supplements is diminished and diminished and diminished. It's great for customers. It's not great if you're reliant on a monopoly income stream, and that's the problem that we've got. But actually, if you took the road network and looked at HGVs on the road network, that is also true. HGV on the road networks are bailed out by private motorists day in, day out, and as they move to electric cars, that dynamic will also change. So we've got a great big opportunity ahead to look at how that pricing of transport is done in the economy, where the value points are and what that means for the respective modes.
Okay, I can see we've got more questions in the room. Jane in the middle here, Kush, please, if you wouldn't mind. Please keep the questions coming in online as well. I've got a few coming in, but we could do some more.
Thank you.
Jane.
Jane Cornthwaite. I just wanted to link a couple of things that have been said this morning. The first one is, I think, on the contracting process, so the franchising process. I think one of the disappointing things that's happened over the last couple of years is that we've missed the opportunity to have public consultations about what we want from our services, which was something that the contracting service did. And that was really quite a good opportunity for there to be slightly more public discourse about what we're looking for from our transport sector or railway sector. And I think as well, I think coming on to the other point about multimodal and about how we make choices between freight and logistics and passenger and personal travel, we haven't really had a very big debate sort of more widely about that. So your average person in the street doesn't think about, well, if we've got more freight on the roads, our motorways are going to be less busy. So I think actually encouraging the opportunity for us to articulate what some of these trade-offs are, what some of these important trade-offs are going forward over the next 20, 30 years, when we will be looking towards decarbonising our economy. We are going to have to change our transport system as a result of that, because in a few years' time, our car fleet will be very much more electric. We will have to adapt our rail network in order to accommodate the fact that people will be perceiving what's an environmentally friendly form of transport in a different way. So I think actually starting to have some of this debate now slightly more widely, so that the public in general and those who are users and those communities that we're serving are in a better place to accept that there will be changes, and that will have some short-term winners and losers in the interests of a long-term better economy, a long-term sustainable economy.
Thank you, Jane. Anybody want to...
I both violently agree with Jane, but also add a note of caution. I'm absolutely right about that public discourse, but if you look at the moment, please don't quote me on this, but at the moment we're having a crazy consultation exercise on ticket office closures that suggests there's a choice, and a consultation that actually doesn't articulate the true choices in front of people is not meaningful dialogue. Mm-hmm. And I think we're now caught in legislative lowercase r regulatory requirements to have formulaic consultation. And there's no point in consulting people on ticket office closures if you don't say what the alternative is. If the alternative between ticket office hour reductions is fewer trains, then the consultation should be which of those would you really like in different places. But all the time you have an abstract consultation about, shall we do this harm to you? Well, guess what? You get 700,000, 750,000 people saying, we don't want it. That's not a dialogue, is it? And I think that's what we've got to get out of. And I do think some of the franchising specification consultation did fall into that trap of thinking that everything was a free gift. And it's one of the reasons why we've ended up now with a very significant cost base. Because it's very hard to do that in a way that's a really strong public discourse.
I'm just going to take a question from online, then I'm going to come back to the room, because it follows on from that. Gianluca, you know, formulating a long-term strategy for rail in a politicised environment is very challenging, unrealistic, he says. How can we depoliticise the railway? I mean, Alistair, you put it in there. We have a complex system. We're going to change fares, change ticketing office hours. How do we take that through? Because they are political decisions, ultimately. What's the best way through to navigate that complexity?
Well, I mean, I think I said it. You know, a single guided mind that sets out the business plan, says this is what we're going to do, and then does it. At some stage, politics has to be involved in the railway, but it also has to let it get on with doing what it does. And you can have a system. I mean, I remember when I was running Wales, you know, you tried to put up the local fare by 7p, and someone would come in and tell you can't do it, you know. And that's very, very micromanaging.
Yes. But,
you know, actually, if you sit down and write the business plan for the railway, these are the services we're going to run, and this is why. This is the flexibility we need. This is the capacity we're going to put in the network. This is the staff we're going to have in there, and this is how we're going to migrate the service offer, the way we buy and sell tickets, and what tickets there are. That seems to be something you can get behind. Now, there's going to be, every single day, there's going to be thousands of little things that happen, because that's the complex operating environment we live in, and you've got to accept that. But actually, the longer-term gain from having that clarity on what we're doing and that accountability for what we're doing, I think will pay back.
Thank you, Alistair.
Can I just come on that? I mean, look, I've got a book on my shelf at home. It's called Railway Problems, and it dates from 1868. It's got a sentence in it. It says, you know, the problems of ownership of the UK railway.
It's not quoting Alistair Gordon, is it?
No, that might well be. It says, they are not new to this land. They have been debated over and over again. Yeah. This is 1868. So in answer to the question, how do we depoliticise the railways? The answer is we can't. So what we have to do is learn to exist in a world which is politicised. Now, I absolutely get the current challenges, and I know Andrew and colleagues are working incredibly hard to try and build the distance back out to a more appropriate level, and that, you know, that is unique to where we are now to some extent. But we can't, and politicians cannot commit money beyond the next general election. It doesn't matter how many times we ask them to do it, they can't. That's not how it works. And no local MP is going to sign up to something that causes harm to people who are going to give them their job back next time. So we have to ask them things in a different way. We have to associate with success. We have to, you know, I've been spinning the same messages between different governments since the beginning of time, and whether that's productivity or carbon or decarbonisation or jobs or skills, you have to go with that flow and look at what's coming up. But the notion that there's some magic bullet that depoliticises it, we simply can't.
Okay.
I can come on about the strategy and stuff. So we have a long-term strategy. I think there's more we can do to perhaps line local priorities, so sort of the national position. Picking up Alistair's point about the guiding mind, which I think is absent, but I would still have to caution just that point and say it's fine to have a guiding mind, but it has to be representative of the local population. And I think, you know, earlier colleague in Scotland, Jonathan Pugh, actually, I do know quite well previously. But actually, you know, we do aspire to a devolution that brings that together. So a guiding mind is absolutely fine, but it just can't be another body that's distant from local people, because it just won't work. And we'll be, you know, pretty much in the same place. So, you know, it's all about politicians. Well, they're elected locally to be able to represent people, and it's up to us to work with GBRTT and, you know, the industry to bring the guiding mind back. Absolutely track and train, you know, streamlining contracts, etc., but not lose sight of the specification point that you raised, bringing that back into consultation, proper consultation, not a tick in the box. I think that's where I would like to see planning to be aligned.
Thank you, Mal. We have a question in the front row here, Kush. Actually, we've got 3 questions in the front row, but...
Hi, Richard Mann from Midlands Connect. So my question was picking up on Andrew's point that cities are good for rail and rail is good for cities. Are we making enough of that synergy? Are cities great places to visit? Are we attracting enough? Are we getting the cars out so that they're great places to walk around, having got off our trains, to go to the office, to visit people, whatever, or to shop or what? 1,001 things we do in cities. Does the railway need to be more outward-looking and engage more with improving its key destinations as attractive places to generate traffic? Or actually, does the railway need to focus on sorting its own problems out? So inward-looking or outward-looking?
Oh, look, that's an easy one.
Yeah.
Inward looking is the road to perdition. We've got to be outward looking. And look, I'm slightly embarrassed Denise here. I mean, Denise took a bit of flack from some of her local colleagues about Aussie, the bull in the bull ring. In Birmingham, in New Street. But the point is, what that is doing is about saying that Birmingham New Street is a key part of the city's infrastructure. It's the heart of the city. And actually smart enough to realise that because we get turnover-based rents, is actually we're getting a revenue stream as well from it. But what it's doing is it's saying we are connected. It's why when you go through Birmingham New Street week after week, you'll see events in there. That's just a small illustration on our doorstep about how we need to be integrated into our city fabric. And I'm a massive believer that if you have you have to build your core. It's like any transport system. You build your core offering around the things you're really strong about, but a lot of your revenue then comes from how you manage to maximize your spare capacity. You know, that's exactly how aviation works. Matt and I were talking about that on the way over here. You know, how you make money out of an airline. You know, frankly, you charge your core as much as you can, and then you fill the rest of the seats as cheaply as you can because it's all incremental revenue. And it's the same with freight, with some of the core intermodal flows. If we start turning introspective and think we don't need to be attractive to that broader base, then we really, really miss a massive opportunity. But be realist. Don't chase every opportunity would be my point. Understand what you're really good at, and then actually maximize the periphery around it.
I came to Euston the other night needing to buy some tights, and I walked over to where Boots the Chemist used to be.
I know.
And there's a massive pillar that says putting passengers first, and it's like, but I need tights.
I know. that's a really good example. But because with the HS2 works there, we had to say you can't run it safely, you know. And interestingly, we've had more grief from losing Boots than anything else really, because that Boots was critical, isn't it? Because there is nowhere else in the Euston area. I can say, wait, by time, I've not tried, but I can.
If you know, Andrew, let me know.
I can well imagine that there's nowhere else. Exactly.
Okay.
Online. I buy mine online.
All right, we're in the last few minutes, and we've got at least 3 questions in the room. Richard, you've got the microphone.
I have, yeah. So, Richard Harper, Director at Steer, and thanks to the panel for an excellent discussion. So, we've heard, I think, that from the pejorative use of statistics, we're an industry that's unimportant, I think. But actually, that means that the headlines are being driven by our detractors. And I think, we've heard from the industry today, what can we do to harness rail's dependents, rail's customers, rail's supporters, rail's advocates, to help get the message across how important this industry is to those people and those industries that really do depend on it.
Securing advocacy from others. Who wants to?
I'll tell you a John Smith story. So John signed up an Instagram influencer a few years ago at GB Rail Freight. I don't think John even knew what Instagram was, his team did. And he took said influencer out on a cab ride, and at every station there were teenage girls lined up. And they got out of the cab at one of these teenagers came up to John Smith and said, would you hold my baby whilst I have a photo with this influencer? And the point was that, rail...
It's the bourgeois by chance.
Yes. Rail freight isn't something that you would think of as an appealing message to teenagers. When I tell my kids about it, they glaze over, as do their friends. But there are ways of landing messages to audiences who are not generally associating themselves with rail. So if we look at the audiences that we need to get to, what are the things that matter to them and how do we talk about it? And that was my inward investment point, is that this isn't a rail, inward investment, those schemes are not rail schemes, but we need to be friends with them. So who are we not being friends with, and how do we become friends with them to build up not necessarily the user base, but the supporter base, that people who like having the railways, even if they don't use it, are an important part.
I mean, I would absolutely agree with what Maggie just said, and that's why I touched on the point about being easy to do business with, because if we can make it as a system as simpler to get things done, and as opposed to just talk to, then we get traction. And secondly, that's why I think the power of devolved administrations is so important. There's always going to be a case that, particularly in an industry that's so dependent on public funds, the government will say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? And they want to suppress your voice a little bit, understandably, because, look, I'm paying you all this money. You know, we don't pay you to lobby. And that's entirely legitimate. But that's why we need to have people who understand that value on our behalf, and who can also say, this is an industry, actually, that's in a bit of a mess, or it doesn't do this well, but I trust those people. They've got a clear view. I can do business with them. So they need to have confidence in both the narrative, but also the people in the business.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze one more question in, if I can, over here. Sorry, Terry.
Yeah, thanks. Toby Ratcliffe, West Midlands Rail Executive. I'm not going to get into the tights question, and it was still the right decision to get rid of Sock Shop and the concourse at Euston and free up passengers.
I think they got rid of themselves, didn't they?
Yes. The Sock Shop for a long time.
But I think the question is going back to what rail does for the economy and economic investment. And it's a point I think Andy Street made yesterday about what business needs rail to do is to provide certainty and certainty of investment. And we've made the point about long-term decision-making being key, and actually having that long-term plan and sticking to it, which I think is exactly the right thing to do. But we seem to be going backwards at the moment, and every decision almost is focusing on the short-term costs rather than the outputs. And we've seen this over the years with rail, that projects have been de-scoped, we've not got the original outputs from them. How can we turn that corner in the current climate?
Can I just add a little bit of dose of, just a bit of a check on that? I wouldn't say every decision. I mentioned TRU, 10 billion quid. We must, if we as a sector dismiss 10 billion pounds, then no wonder government says, you know, you're just a money tree. Or a money pit. If you think, you know, we're working very closely on Midlands Rail Hub. It is hard. The whole failure to publish the enhancement pipeline, you know, is a frustration for everyone. It was frankly an utterly predictable frustration. The minute you politicise that process, you almost guarantee that sort of a reluctance to bring up bad news. But I do think we should talk much more about the things we actually are getting well funded at the moment and which we're committed to alongside that. Otherwise, we just sound as if we're in a bottomless pit of desire.
Okay.
I travelled out on Crossrail to East London last week with Andy Lord, the Transport Commissioner there for London. Crossrail's an amazing experience. You know, the stations are amazing, the service is amazing, the trains are amazing. And when you travelled out to East London, we went onto the DLR, there's cranes everywhere as new housing is being built and development. And you do see that if we can get the infrastructure in and working, then you'll get the economy driving behind it.
Positive note to end on. I have to draw it to a close. I'm afraid we could have gone on for a lot longer, but thank you very much to the panellists for their insight, observations, tight shopping, vicious circles about breaking through business cases, and various other things. So very grateful for the lively debate. A quick reminder, this is the first of 3. Our next session is next Wednesday in Manchester. Still places available if you wish to join us in person or online, where we have Vernon Everett, the Transport Commissioner for Greater Manchester, Martin Tugwell, Paul McMahon, Tricia Williams, who will be shortly becoming the Managing Director for Northern, and Daniel Coles from the Community Rail Network joining us to talk about how we integrate transport through into serving our communities in a more sustainable manner. And then on the 18th in London, serving our passengers. How do we lean into that challenge of making sure we are responsive to their needs in a very agile way, which the panel has talked about, so that we can grow revenue to support and fund the industry? So please join us. You can find registration details online. So with that, I thank everybody online for joining us. I thank those in the room. Those in the room, you get more coffee and sugar and things outside. For those online, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much.
Well done.